Think about someone you used to know, someone unusually sharp. The person in every room who always seemed to notice where things were heading before anyone else did. The one who asked questions that made conversations suddenly uncomfortable because they reached beneath the surface too quickly. They were ambitious once, visible once, engaged with the world in a way that almost seemed relentless. And then slowly, almost invisibly, something changed. They stopped performing. They stopped trying to explain themselves to people who never fully understood them in the first place. They became quieter, more private, harder to reach. Not because they failed, not because they lost their intelligence, but because their intelligence began turning inward instead of outward. And if you are honest with yourself, maybe you have felt this happening inside your own life too. Highly intelligent people often begin by chasing the same forms of success everyone else does: recognition, achievement, visibility, status, but over time many of them discover something unsettling. The noise of constant participation starts to feel empty compared to the depth of uninterrupted thought. The ambition does not disappear, it changes direction. The energy that once went into networking and proving themselves begins moving towards solitude, reflection, books, ideas, projects nobody else understands yet. History is full of this pattern. Isaac Newton developed some of his greatest work while isolated from society during the Plague Years. Henry David Thoreau walked away from ordinary life and disappeared into the quiet of Walden Pond. To outsiders, it looked like withdrawal, maybe even failure. But what if it was neither? What if some minds eventually realize that constant visibility comes at the cost of depth? What if going quiet is not a collapse, but the beginning of something far more important? Sometimes the people who stop trying to fit in are not losing themselves at all. Sometimes they are finally becoming who they actually are. Carl Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives living inside psychological patterns they never consciously chose. They inherit definitions of success from parents, culture, school systems, social media, and workplaces, then mistake those inherited scripts for their own authentic desires. Jung called this identification with the collective, the process of becoming so merged with society's expectations that you can no longer distinguish your real voice from the one the world trained you to repeat. Most people never notice this happening because the collective rewards conformity with belonging. If everyone around you values the same ambitions, fears the same failures, and measures life by the same standards, then following the script feels natural. But highly self-aware people often begin noticing something uncomfortable beneath the surface. They start seeing the machinery behind the curtain. They realize that much of what society calls ambition is actually programmed anxiety, that many opinions people defend passionately were inherited long before they were examined critically, that entire lives are often built around chasing approval instead of truth. Once you begin seeing these patterns, it becomes almost impossible to return to unconscious participation. The social world starts feeling strangely artificial, like a performance everyone agreed to continue without questioning why. Jung believed this realization marks the beginning of individuation, the painful psychological process of becoming who you actually are instead of who you were conditioned to become. Individuation is not self-improvement in the modern motivational sense. It is not about becoming more successful, more productive, or more socially admired. It is about separating your authentic inner life from the collective programming that shaped you. And this process is rarely comfortable because society depends on predictability. Systems function best when people behave in familiar, manageable ways. The moment someone begins thinking independently, questioning inherited assumptions, or refusing to perform according to expected social roles, subtle resistance appears. People start calling you unrealistic, difficult, too intense, too sensitive, or disconnected from reality. The collective pushes back because authentic individuality disrupts social equilibrium. This is why many intelligent people gradually stop trying to fit in. Not because they hate people, but because they can no longer fully participate in systems that feel psychologically false. What looks like alienation from the outside is often the beginning of authenticity from within. The loneliness they experience is not always dysfunction. Sometimes it is simply the cost of seeing clearly in a world built on unconscious imitation. There is a hidden exhaustion that many highly intelligent people carry for years without ever having language for it. It is not physical exhaustion, and it is not always emotional exhaustion in the traditional sense. It comes from constantly translating the way their minds naturally work into forms other people can comfortably receive. When someone thinks in systems, patterns, layers, and long chains of consequence, ordinary conversation often feels painfully compressed. Most social environments reward simplicity, speed, confidence, and easy conclusions, but complex minds rarely operate that way. Their thoughts arrive with nuance, contradiction, uncertainty, and interconnected context. So every interaction becomes an act of reduction. They shorten ideas that should take an hour into sentences that take 30 seconds. They remove qualifications because people mistake nuance for confusion. They simplify conclusions because complexity makes others uncomfortable. Over time, this creates something deeply draining, what could be called translation exhaustion. The person begins feeling like they are constantly shrinking their actual mind to fit the psychological limits of the room around them. And the exhausting part is not only social, it becomes internal. The repeated habit of simplifying yourself eventually starts bleeding into private thought. You begin censoring complexity before it fully forms. You stop following ideas to their natural depth, because experience has taught you that depth creates distance between you and other people. There is a subtle sense of betrayal that starts building beneath everyday interactions. You say something simpler than what you truly mean and feel the small internal fracture immediately afterward. You nod through shallow conversations while part of your mind quietly disconnects. You learn how to appear understandable while feeling increasingly unseen. Carl Jung describes something similar through his concept of the persona, the social mask human beings develop in order to function within society. For most people, the gap between the mask and the authentic self remains manageable. But for highly self-aware individuals whose natural way of thinking falls far outside socially rewarded norms, that gap can become psychologically suffocating. The persona stops feeling like a tool and starts feeling like a prison. They become exhausted not because they are antisocial, but because social performance requires constant self-editing. Every meeting becomes a calculation. Every casual conversation becomes another moment of compressing complexity into acceptable simplicity. Eventually, many intelligent people begin withdrawing not out of arrogance, but out of preservation. Something inside them realizes that performing a smaller version of themselves day after day is cognitively damaging. The silence they begin seeking is not emptiness. It is relief. Relief from translation. Relief from performance. Relief from the exhausting pressure of constantly reshaping their minds into forms the world finds easier to consume. One of the most uncomfortable truths about intelligence is that highly intelligent people often become social threats without ever intending to. Not because they are arrogant, cruel, or trying to dominate others, but because clarity itself can feel threatening. Human beings tie their thinking very closely to identity. Most people do not simply hold opinions. They emotionally inhabit them. Their beliefs become part of how they understand themselves, their competence, and their place in the world. This is why intellectual comparison activates defensive reactions so quickly. When someone enters a conversation and naturally sees contradictions, deeper patterns, or hidden assumptions others missed, it creates an invisible psychological pressure inside the room. The threat is rarely acknowledged directly. Instead, it appears disguised as criticism. The intelligent person becomes too theoretical, too intense, not practical, or hard to work with. But beneath those labels is often something much simpler: discomfort. Carl Jung described this process through the idea of shadow projection. When another person unintentionally exposes limitations we do not want to confront inside ourselves, the mind protects the ego by projecting the discomfort outward. Instead of thinking, maybe my understanding is incomplete, people often decide there is something wrong with them. Highly intelligent people become mirrors simply by operating at their natural level of perception. They question frameworks others unconsciously depend on. They expose assumptions people built identities around. And because most social systems value emotional comfort and predictability more than truth, the person questioning the structure often becomes treated as the problem rather than the insight they bring. This dynamic appears everywhere, especially in workplaces and institutions. The individual who challenges inefficient systems, asks deeper questions, or refuses shallow explanations is frequently perceived as disruptive even when they are correct. Over time, many intelligent people learn that independent thinking carries social consequences. Eventually, they stop trying to win acceptance from systems that punish authenticity. The mathematician Grigory Perelman embodied this completely. After solving one of the most difficult problems in mathematics, he rejected both fame and enormous financial reward. Many people interpreted his withdrawal as instability, but another interpretation is possible. Perhaps he understood that public recognition would require transforming himself into a performer for institutions he no longer respected. Carl Jung made a similar choice in his own way when he withdrew for long periods into the stone tower he built in rural Switzerland. Removed from social expectation, status performance, and institutional pressure, he produced some of the most influential psychological work in modern history. What outsiders often call withdrawal is sometimes something very different. Sometimes it is a refusal to keep betraying one's own mind for the comfort of the collective. Intelligent people do not always stop trying to fit in because they hate society. Often they stop because they finally recognize how much society demands them to become smaller in order to belong. If you have been feeling yourself pulling away from noise, from performative conversations, from the exhausting pressure to constantly explain who you are, maybe something important is happening inside you. Maybe the quiet is not a symptom of failure. Maybe it is direction. Highly intelligent people often reach a point where solitude stops feeling lonely and starts feeling like relief. Relief from performance. Relief from simplifying themselves for rooms that cannot hold their depth. They lose interest in small talk not because they lack emotion, but because their minds crave something more real than endless social ritual. Jung believed the psyche naturally pushes people toward environments where their deeper self can emerge fully. Sometimes that means withdrawing from the collective long enough to hear your own thoughts clearly again. History is filled with people who disappeared from visibility in order to do the work that eventually shaped the world. Newton in isolation during the plague, Thoreau beside Walden Pond, Jung alone in his stone tower writing by candlelight. None of them were disappearing. They were becoming. The world simply recognized it later. So if part of you has been craving more silence, more depth, more space to think honestly, do not immediately assume something is wrong. The question is not whether you are withdrawing. The question is what you are building there in the quiet. Build the tower. Do the work. Quiet minds have always recognized each other eventually. And sometimes the people who feel most alone are simply the ones thinking at a depth the world has not caught up to yet.